I was traveling alone from New York to North Carolina to attend my grandfather's funeral. It was right around 11 p.m. when I pulled my car off Interstate 95 in Virginia. The rain was coming down so hard that the windshield wipers couldn't even keep up. My GPS had completely stopped working because of the terrible signal in this dark, rural area. The dim glow from the dashboard was the only thing lighting up my face, and that low fuel light just kept staring at me with its annoying orange color. I had no choice but to look for a gas station or a small motel to spend the night. After a few minutes of driving blindly through the thick pine trees, a fading neon sign caught my eye. It was flickering in a green light, displaying Pine Valley Motel, vacancy. I immediately turned down the narrow, muddy driveway. The motel was incredibly old, built in that 1970s cabin-style layout. There was only one light working inside the front office. I parked the car and ran through the pouring rain. When I pushed the office door open, a tiny brass bell chimed overhead. The smell inside was strange, a mix of dampness, mold, and some cheap chemical cleaner trying to mask the scent of something else. Behind the worn-out wooden counter sat an old man with incredibly thick glasses, making his eyes look huge and completely unnatural. He was wearing a dirty flannel shirt, and he didn't even look up from his old magazine until a few long seconds had passed. I asked him for a room for the night. He looked at me very slowly, then gave me a hollow smile, showing yellow, decaying teeth.
He didn't speak.
He just reached down, grabbed a heavy metal key with a number 14 on it, and placed it on the counter. He wanted $20 in cash, so I paid him. He pointed his hand toward the dark path outside and said in a dry, raspy voice, "Last cabin on the left. Don't open the door for anyone after midnight." I figured it was just a stupid joke from an old guy living in isolation, so I took the key and walked out. I drove the car down to cabin number 14. It was completely isolated from the rest, surrounded by trees on three sides. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The room was freezing. It had a double bed, an old TV with a massive screen, and a single window facing the dark woods in the back. I tried to turn on the heater, but the unit just let out a loud rattling sound and blew out cold, dusty air. I decided to just lay down with my clothes on under the heavy blankets, hoping to fall asleep quickly. It was getting close to midnight when I started hearing strange noises. It wasn't the rain. It was the sound of footsteps, very light and very slow, walking around the cabin. The footsteps were sinking into the mud, moving with a steady rhythm. I felt tense, but I tried to convince myself it was just wildlife, like a raccoon or a deer. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right at the back wall of the cabin, directly behind the headboard of my bed. I held my breath. Then I heard a faint scratching sound on the wood outside. It sounded like someone was dragging their fingernails very slowly across the wall. I got up as quietly as I could and moved toward the window. I looked through the rain-streaked glass but couldn't see anything, just total darkness and trees moving with the wind. I let out a sigh and turned around to go back to bed. Right at that exact moment, the old phone on the nightstand let out a loud, piercing ring. The sound was so sharp it made my heart jump. I stared at the phone in shock because motels like this rarely have working lines. I walked over and picked up the receiver with a hesitant hand. No one spoke. All I could hear was heavy, rapid breathing and the faint sound of rain in the background. I said, "Hello, who is this?" There was no answer. The breathing just got heavier. Then, I heard a very familiar sound coming through the receiver. It was the sharp chime of that tiny brass bell from the front office, followed by the old man's voice screaming in pure terror, "It's not me. He is inside with you." And before I could even process the sentence, the power cut out completely. The room plunged into total darkness. Right then, I heard the click of the bathroom lock slowly opening from the inside. I sat there on the edge of the bed, completely paralyzed by fear. The darkness was so thick I couldn't even see my own hand. The moldy smell in the room suddenly grew intense, changing into the stench of rotting meat. I could hear it clearly, the wooden bathroom door moving millimeter by millimeter. My breath was shallow, and I fought to stay absolutely silent. I remember my cell phone was in my coat pocket hanging near the front door. I started to move very slowly, crawling on my knees across the bed, and then onto the cold hardwood floor. Every single floorboard I pressed on made a tiny creak, cutting through the dead silence. I reached the coat and successfully pulled out the phone. I lit up the screen, keeping the brightness at the lowest setting so I wouldn't give away my position. I quickly pointed the phone's flashlight toward the bathroom door. The door was wide open. The bathroom was empty, but the floor was covered in fresh, wet mud and a trail of large, bare footprints heading directly toward the small closet in the corner of the room. My hand began to shake violently. I swept the light over to the closet. The closet door was cracked open by a few inches. Through that tiny gap, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a wide, unblinking human eye staring right back at me. It didn't blink. It was surrounded by incredibly pale skin caked in dirt. I let out a muffled gasp and stumbled backward, smashing into the wooden table. The phone slipped from my hand, falling face up on the floor and casting its light onto the ceiling. In that split second, I heard a violent burst of movement from inside the closet. Whatever was in there came rushing out in a bizarre, unnatural way, like a scrambling animal. I didn't wait to see it. I lunged for the front door, frantically fumbling with the locks, and threw myself out into the pouring rain. I ran straight for my car, never looking back. I scrambled inside and slammed the door, locking it instantly. My hands were shaking so bad, I missed the ignition twice. When the engine finally roared to life, I flipped the high beams on. What I saw in the headlights made me slam on the brakes. The old man, the motel owner, was lying flat on the muddy driveway right in front of my car. He was swimming in a pool of dark blood, his huge eyes staring blankly into nothingness. His flannel shirt was completely torn to shreds. Before I could even process the horror, I felt a violent shudder rock the entire car, like something massive had just jumped off the cabin roof and landed dead center on my trunk. I looked up at the rearview mirror and saw a face pressed flat against the back glass. It was a deformed, hairless face with a massive smile stretching from ear to ear. In his hand, he was holding the old corded phone from my room, the wires torn and dangling. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal with everything I had. The tires spun wildly in the mud for a few terrifying seconds before gaining traction, and the car launched forward, swerving right past the old man's body. The thing on the roof rolled backward from the sudden jolt, but I could hear its claws scratching deeply into the metal roof, making a sickening, scraping sound. I drove like a lunatic down that narrow, pitch-black driveway until I finally burst onto the empty rural road. I was doing over 80 miles an hour through the fog and rain, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching for any movement. I was doing over 80 miles an hour through the fog and rain, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, watching for any movement. After about 10 agonizing minutes of driving, the lights of Interstate 95 finally appeared in the distance. I felt a massive wave of relief when I saw a large, fully lit Love's truck stop ahead, surrounded by big semi-trucks. I swung into the parking lot and slammed to a halt right in front of the main store. I got out, gasping for air, and ran inside. The young guy behind the counter looked at me with horror because of my appearance. I was drenched in mud, pale as a ghost, and shaking uncontrollably. I told him to call the police immediately, explaining that there was a murder at the motel down the road. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. I sat in the back of a cruiser, still trembling, and told the investigator every single detail: the footsteps, the phone call, the eye in the closet, the old man's body, and the thing that jumped onto my car. The investigator listened with a grim, skeptical look on his face. They dispatched 2 units to the motel to check it out. I stayed at the gas station for over 2 hours, watched over by another officer. Right around dawn, the investigator came back with a deeply disturbed, confused look on his face. He sat down across from me and said in a low voice, "We went out to the location you described, son. The Pine Valley Motel has been completely abandoned and boarded up since 1994 after a fire destroyed the main office and killed the old owner inside." My head started spinning, and I yelled at him, "That's impossible." He gave me the key. "His body is out there in the mud. Go look for the body." The investigator just looked at me coldly and replied, "We searched the whole place. There are no bodies. The cabins are completely overgrown with weeds and decaying." He continued, "But there was one thing we found that we can't explain." I asked in a trembling voice, "What?" He pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside was the heavy metal key with the number 14. We found this key lying in the thick dust inside the last cabin, covered in your fresh fingerprints. But that's not all. The investigator walked me to the back of my car and shone his flashlight on the roof and trunk. On the metal of the roof, there were deep, long gouges from 5 human-like fingers with sharp claws carved deep into the paint. Right in the middle of the back window, there was a perfect, clear imprint of a human face smudged against the glass, along with a thick, dark residue that the heavy rain hadn't completely washed away. It's been 3 years since that night. I left Virginia and never went back, selling that car the very next day. The police eventually closed the case, writing it off as local vagrants messing around. They never believed my story about the motel. But the horror never really stopped for me. To this day, whenever it rains at night and I'm lying in bed in my new apartment in Chicago, my cell phone will start vibrating from an unknown number. And when I finally pick it up, driven by pure anxiety, I don't hear a voice. Instead, I just hear heavy, rapid breathing and the faint chime of a tiny brass bell ringing somewhere in the background, followed by a slow, faint, scratching sound starting to move along the wall right behind the headboard of my bed.